Hello and welcome to Evrelia.com. This is a video guide to teach you everything you need to know about playing a Destruction Warlock in Mists-of-Pandaria patch 5.3. This guide will be very in-depth to teach you as much about the class as possible, but you can use the menu along the top of the screen to skip to the section of the guide that you want to see. First, let's talk about your stat priorities as Destruction. For Destruction, your stat priorities will be different depending on how many targets are involved in the fight. As always, your main stat is Intellect. Next, you should be hit capped, which is equal to 5,100 rating, or 15%. Expertise rating also contributes directly to hit, so you can use a mixture of hit and expertise to reach the cap. Next, you want to choose between haste and mastery. Haste makes your spells cast faster, which shifts your damage more towards generating more burning embers, and mastery makes your ember consuming spells deal more damage. So how do you choose between them? Well, on single target fights without special mechanics that may alter it, haste is the go-to stat for Destruction by a small amount. However, on fights where you have multiple targets, periods of burst damage, or instances of AoE, Mastery will be a better stat. This means that in basically every situation in Throne of Thunder, Mastery is better than Haste. Generally, if a large amount of damage comes from your ember-consuming spells, Mastery is better. Mastery buffs the damage from Chaos Bolt, Fire and Brimstone, and Shadowburn. Crit is generally not ever worth going for as Destruction unless you can't get Haste or Mastery. When you're gemming for Destruction, until you get to very high gear levels, Intellect scales better than your secondary stats even though gems have twice as much. You can choose either of these two gemming setups depending on your eye level. The first setup on the left is suitable for playing Destruction below 530 eye level because Intellect scales better than your secondary stats do. The setup on the right scales better as your eye level gets higher. The difference between these two gemming options is very small. If you're someone that switches between the other Warlock specs fairly often, you can use the setup on the right since it fits better with the setups for Affliction and Demonology, and is still very strong for Destruction. These are the best enchants for Destruction. It's worth noting that if you're a tailor, you would replace the cloak enchant with Lightweave Embroidery. You can only use the ring enchants if you're an enchanter. Currently the best professions for raiding are engineering and tailoring. There are no glyphs for Destruction that provide DPS increases, but there are glyphs that can increase survivability and utility. Glyph of Conflagrate means that your Conflagrate can snare the target without Immolate being present on the target. This means on fights with slowable adds, you can conflag them as soon as they spawn to get an instant snare on them without the need to precast Immolate. Glyph of Hellstone doubles the effectiveness of your Hellstone but restores the health over time. This is a great defensive cooldown for fights with constant and steady damage, but less effective for spiky damage. Glyph of Siphon Life gives you a great flow of passive healing over time, and Glyph of Soulstone causes your Soulstone to resurrect the target with full health. You can use any of these glyphs and it's very recommended that you change them from encounter to encounter based upon the needs of each fight. The Observer provides the highest DPS of your pets and should be used in basically all situations involving a pet, unless you need heavy target swapping capabilities, in which case you can use the Imp instead. When you sacrifice your pet, it doesn't matter which one you sacrifice unless you have a specific need for one of its abilities. Talents in Mists-of-Pandaria are mostly situational choices. Here's a good default set of talents. The first tier of talents focuses on healing. Soul Leech provides a constant absorption shield, which can stack very highly and is great for reducing damage of frequent attacks such as Thunderstruck or interrupting Jolt. Dark Regeneration increases all healing you take for 12 seconds and also restores 30% of your health in this time. This is very powerful when paired with a Health Stone. In Tier 2, you can choose between crowd control abilities. Shadow Fury is your main stun ability and is useful for any fights with stunnable adds such as Lei Shen, Tortos or Council. On any other fights you'll want to take Mortal Coil for the healing it provides. In Tier 3 you can choose between defensive cooldowns. Soul Link effectively grants you 30% increased health and is great for fights with frequent damage spikes that come too often for your longer cooldowns. Sacrificial Pact is a 1 minute cooldown ability that grants you a shield equal to your pet's health, or your health if you have no pet out. This is good for high damage abilities that come slightly more spread out, such as Jikun's Quills. Finally, you also have Dark Bargain. This has a long cooldown, but it has the highest life-saving potential, and it can mitigate attacks such as Lei Shen's Static Shock. I use Soul Link on most encounters. Tier 4 features utility talents. Unbound Will is only useful on fights with dispellable magic effects such as Jinrock and Council. For all other fights, you'd want to take Burning Rush for massively increased mobility. Tier 5 talents features direct damage increasing talents. Now for Destruction you can actually select any of these talents. Grimoire of Supremacy and Grimoire of Service are basically identical and are the best talents to use for single target or AoE encounters. Grimoire of Sacrifice is best used on fights where you have a lot of burning embers and a lot of your damage is coming from Shadowburn and Chaos Bolt, such as Horadon or Primordius, For most fights though, you'll want to stick with Supremacy. Remember that Grimoire of Sacrifice does not affect AoE spells. Tier 6 talents provide situational DPS increases. For most encounters, you'll take Killjaden's Cunning for the mobility it provides. For your trinkets as destruction, you're really not going to notice a significant difference no matter what you use. These are the 3 that I would recommend you choose from. Personally, I find the duration of Chase too short to be particularly useful since it doesn't last long enough for the opener burst, but it's definitely viable throughout the fight. So for that reason my pick is Breath and Wooshalays, but you really won't notice a big difference no matter which ones you pick. Destruction's rotation is based around the concept of burning embers. Some of your spells generate burning embers and some of your spells consume the embers. Generally, the spells that consume embers do significantly more damage than the ones that don't. You can have up to 4 burning embers and each ember is comprised of 10 ember bits, so you can see the ember building up as you go. First, let's talk about your spells that generate embers. First off is Destruction's dot ability, which is Immolate. Immolate has a 2-second cast and a facing requirement, and critical ticks provide 1 ember bit. You also have the ability Conflagrate. This is an instant cast ability with 2 charges. You regenerate 1 charge every 12 seconds, and Conflagrate generates 1 ember bit on hit or 2 ember bits on crit. It also provides you with 3 stacks of Backdraft. You can get 6 charges of Backdraft if you use it twice in a row. Backdraft is a buff that reduces the cast time and mana cost of your next Incinerate or Chaos Bolt. Using Incinerate consumes 1 stack of Backdraft, and using Chaos Bolt consumes 3 stacks of Backdraft. Generally, Backdraft is better used with Incinerate, but there can be occasions where you'll want to use it with Chaos Bolt. You have Incinerate, which is your single target filler spell. This generates 1 ember bit on hit or 2 on crit. It uses 1 stack of Backdraft when cast. You have Rain of Fire. This is primarily an AoE spell, but it's also a DPS gain for single target. It has a high mana cost and lasts for 8 seconds. It isn't channeled, and enemies that have Immolate on take additional damage from Rain of Fire. It has a chance to generate an ember bit for each target it hits. Finally, you have Fell Flame. It does less damage than Incinerate and costs more mana, and generates the same number of ember bits. It should only be used while moving if you don't have Killjaden's Cunning. Next you have your ember consuming spells. Your main ember consuming spell is Chaos Bolt. Chaos Bolt always crits, but additional crit chance will increase the damage it does. Chaos Bolt consumes 3 stacks of Backdraft if you have them, making it cast faster, although this is only a good idea in certain situations. You also have Shadow Burn. This can only be used on enemies that are below 20%, and it doesn't always crit. It puts a debuff on targets it hits that returns 15% of your mana back after 5 seconds. If the target dies with this debuff on, you get 2 full burning embers refunded. For AoE you have Fire and Brimstone. This is an ability that you can toggle on or off. When you toggle it on, your Incinerates, Immolates and Conflagrates will each cost a burning ember to cast, do AoE damage, but will do reduced damage. Spells that are cast when you have Fire and Brimstone active will benefit from your mastery, but will not benefit from Grimoire of Sacrifice. Havoc is your main cleave ability. This is a castable debuff that you place on an enemy, with a 25-second cooldown. After casting it, the next 1 Chaos Bolt, or the next 3 other single target spells that you cast on other targets will be duplicated and also cast on the Havoced target. You also have Dark Soul. This is a cooldown ability that increases your crit chance by 30% for 20 seconds. Before we talk about how to play, there are a few basic mechanics that you need to understand in order to do maximum DPS. Firstly, you need to understand how temporary buffs and procs affect your damage. If you cast a Chaos Bolt without any trinket procs or other special buffs active, the damage will be significantly lower than if you cast it with Dark Soul active, for example. The same applies to effects such as Skull Banner, Lightweave or trinket procs. When casting Chaos Bolts or spells that consume burning embers, it's best to try and only cast them when you have these effects active as much as possible, unless you're at risk of capping on ember. When it comes to casting Immolate, remember that Immolate will snapshot your current stats at the time of its cast. This means that if you cast it when you have intellect procs active, it will benefit from those procs for its entire duration. It won't update dynamically. Similarly, if you cast Immolate and then gain procs after it's already up, it won't benefit unless you recast it. When it comes to refreshing Immolate, due to our ability Pandemic, you can recast it at any point when it has less than 50% of its base duration remaining, and you won't lose any of its tips. Let's talk about your opening rotation. Now I can't say for sure that this is definitely the absolute best way to open, but it's the opener a lot of top warlocks use. At the start of the fight, use a Potion of the Jade Serpent and precast an Incinerate and an Immolate, timed so that they both land as the boss is pulled. Next, use Rain of Fire and Conflagrate twice. Now pop your cooldowns and cast Incinerate until you have less than 3 stacks of Backdraft, and then Chaos Bolt until you run out of embers. After that, cast Immolate again and continue your rotation. The reason you cast 4 Incinerates is because you ideally want to build up your embers and drop below 3 stacks of Backdraft for optimal use. However, you need to pay attention to your procs. If you have trinkets with very short duration that will fall off before you can do your Chaos Bolts, you may want to Chaos Bolt sooner to make use of them. The reason that Incinerate is better use of Backdraft is because Incinerate only consumes 1 stack of Backdraft, and also benefits a lot from the reduced mana cost. You'll find that you run on single target if you cast too many Incinerates without Backdraft up. However, it's not always a bad idea to cast Chaos Bolt with Backdraft. If you need to burst a target down quickly, a Backdrafted Chaos Bolt can be the best option. This can also be true if you have intellect procs or buffs that are about to expire, and you need to cast as many Chaos Bolts as possible before they fall off. A Backdrafted Chaos Bolt may allow you to finish the cast before the buffs expire. Throughout the fight you need to keep up Immolate and use Conflagrate often enough to prevent yourself from reaching 2 charges so that none of them are wasted. Chaos Bolt should generally only be used when you have significant intellect procs or buffs active. This is because Chaos Bolt will do a lot more damage when it's used with these effects, and you're only limited by how fast you can generate Burning Embers anyway. Of course, there are exceptions to this. You can Chaos Bolt if you don't have intellect procs up if you're at risk of capping on Embers, or if you need to burst down a target quickly for a specific encounter, since that's still a lot more damage than your other spells. Don't just Chaos Bolt for no reason as soon as you get an Ember if you have no reason to cast it. The same logic applies to Shadowburn. Shadowburn replaces Chaos Bolt on enemies that are below 20%. When a boss is approaching 20%, you should start pooling Embers. Once the boss is below 20%, wait until you have Intellect procs or Dark Soul active, and cast several Shadowburns in a row for massive damage. Shadowburn should also be used on enemies that are about to die. On fights such as Horadon, anytime you see an ad below 20%, you should immediately Shadowburn it. This is because if it dies within a few seconds of your Shadowburn, you'll get 2 Burning Embers refunded. You can use this macro to immediately interrupt your cast and cast Shadowburn instead, to make sure that you always get those snipes in. Generally, you should try to keep Rain of Fire up as much as possible. Rain of Fire is a small DPS increase on 1 target if every tick will hit the target. It's a significant DPS increase on 2 or more targets. The reason that it provides a DPS increase is not from the damage it does, but because it generates a very large amount of Burning Embers, allowing you to cast more Chaos Bolts and Shadowburns throughout the fight. Generally, you want to keep up Rain of Fire ticking all the time, but there are situations where it's okay to let it fall off. For example, if you have a Trinket proc and several Burning Embers saved up already, it can be beneficial to spend the time casting Chaos Bolt rather than casting an extra Rain of Fire and potentially failing to get your Chaos Bolt cast off before the buffs fall off. Similarly, if you have so many Embers that you're gaining them faster than you can spend them, it can be okay to let Rain of Fire fall off in order to burn through your Embers. Just operate on the logic. If you need Embers, keep Rain of Fire up. If you need to do burst damage and you already have Embers, let it fall off. Havoc is your main cleave ability. Generally, you should be using Havoc as often as possible in order to maximize your damage. There are several ways to use Havoc depending on the situation. The best use of Havoc is to pair it with Shadowburn. Obviously 3 Shadowburns is ideal, but if you can cast even 1 Shadowburn and 2 of any other spell, it'll be more optimal than Chaos Bolt. If you can Havoc the boss and cast 3 Shadowburns on a dying ad, you can do a huge amount of cleave damage at once. Fights such as Horadon and Primordius, you can more or less exclusively use Shadowburn with Havoc. If you can't Shadowburn, the next best use of Havoc is Chaos Bolt, especially if you can cast it with Intellect procs, but using it without can still be a DPS gain since it's effectively doubling your damage. Remember that Chaos Bolt consumes all 3 stacks of Havoc. You would use Chaos Bolt with Havoc on fights such as Council, Twin Consorts and Raden. There are some fights where you have multiple targets but it does not benefit your raid to DPS the secondary target. A good example is Megara or the massive Golems on Dark Animus. On fights like this it would be a waste to Havoc a Chaos Bolt, since the damage does not contribute to your raid. Instead, you should use Havoc with Incinerates. The damage of the cleave Incinerate won't matter, but you'll generate extra Burning Embers by doing this, resulting in an effective DPS increase. A really helpful macro for using Havoc is this one. What this macro does is cast Havoc on your focus target. The way you can use this is to put the boss on focus at the start of the fight, mostly for fights when you're DPSing ads a lot. Whenever your Havoc comes off cooldown, you press this macro and it will cast Havoc on the boss without you having to change targets. This is really useful when ads are about to die, because you can put Havoc up on the boss and Shadowburn the ads without having to switch targets, resulting in a lot of Shadowburn damage cleaved onto the boss. Sometimes you'll want to Havoc ads instead of Havocing the boss however, so you should have separate keylines for Havoc and for focus Havoc. Other than using Havoc on cooldown, you should keep Immolate up on every target and continue your single target rotation. Try to cast Rain of Fire so that it hits every target possible. For real AoE scenarios with more than 4 targets, keep up your Rain of Fire and use Fire and Brimstone instead of your usual spells with the same priority as normal. Keep up Fire and Brimstone Immolate, use Fire and Brimstone Conflagrate on cooldown, and use Fire and Brimstone Incinerate as your filler. You should still try to Shadowburn dying ads as much as possible, especially if you can Havoc cleave it. Thank you for watching my guide. If you want more, please visit Evrelia.com or watch some of my other videos. Please remember to rate, comment and subscribe.